They disappeared for a while. Maybe it was months. Maybe it was years. The phone calls stopped. The constant availability vanished. The person who used to show up for everyone, absorb everything, carry the weight of every relationship they touched, went quiet. And the people around them panicked. They called it depression. They called it selfishness. They called it a breakdown. Carl Jung would have called it something else entirely. He would have recognized it as the necessary descent that precedes the most powerful transformation a human being can undergo. Because the empath didn't break. They went somewhere most people never have the courage to go. And now they're coming back. But they're not coming back as who they were. Jung spent decades studying a pattern that fascinated and disturbed him. Certain patients, almost always the deeply empathic ones, would reach a point where they withdrew from life completely. They stopped performing, stopped caretaking, stopped absorbing. They entered what looked like psychological death, a period so isolating and disorienting that everyone around them assumed something had gone terribly wrong. But Jung observed that these patients weren't dying. They were gestating. Something was being built inside that silence that couldn't be built in the noise of their previous existence. And when they finally emerged, the person who returned was so fundamentally different from the person who left that it disturbed everyone who had known them before. Jung called this the return phase of individuation. It's the final stage of awakening that almost no one talks about because most people never reach it. The spiritual marketplace sells you the crisis, sells you the dark night, sells you the breakdown and the shedding and the ego death. But they never tell you about what happens after. They never describe the moment when the empath who dismantled themselves in isolation has to walk back into a world that hasn't changed at all while they've changed completely. Today I'm going to show you what Jung discovered about this final stage, why it's the hardest part of the entire awakening process, what happens inside the empath during the return, and why the person who comes back possesses something that most people will never understand. To grasp what the return actually is, you need to understand what preceded it. Jung documented that empaths who reach this stage had already survived something most people couldn't endure. They'd gone through the shadow confrontation, facing every rejected, denied, buried piece of themselves without flinching. They'd experienced ego dissolution, the terrifying period where their entire identity structure collapsed, and they didn't know who they were anymore. They had sat in the void, that unbearable emptiness between who they used to be and who they hadn't yet become. Most people who enter this process get stuck somewhere along the way. They touch the shadow and retreat. They feel the ego dissolving and panic back into their old identity. They glimpse the void and immediately fill it with a new relationship, a new spiritual practice, a new distraction. But some empaths don't retreat. They stay in the fire until it finishes its work, and those are the ones who reach the return. Jung observed that the return doesn't happen suddenly. There's no dramatic moment of re-entry. Instead, there's a slow reorientation toward life that feels nothing like the empath's previous way of engaging with the world. Before the descent, the empath engaged with life through absorption. They experienced reality by taking it into themselves. Other people's emotions, other people's problems, other people's energy. Their entire relationship with existence was based on permeability. The world flowed into them, and they had no mechanism for filtering what entered. After the descent, something fundamental has shifted in their psychological architecture. They still perceive everything they used to perceive. The sensitivity hasn't diminished. If anything, it's sharpened. But the relationship between perception and identity has completely changed. They can see without becoming. They can feel without absorbing. They can witness without drowning. This distinction is what makes the return so disorienting for everyone who knew the empath before. The people in their life were accustomed to a specific version of this person, the one who was always available, always accommodating, always willing to set themselves aside for others. That version felt safe to be around because it was controllable. You could project onto the old empath, lean on them, take from them, and they'd allow it because they didn't know they had a choice. The returned empath knows they have a choice, and that knowledge changes everything about how they move through the world. Jung described this as the shift from unconscious empathy to conscious presence. The unconscious empath feels everything and is controlled by those feelings. The conscious empath, the returned one, perceives everything and chooses how to respond. This isn't numbness or detachment, it's sovereignty. The empath hasn't lost their capacity to feel deeply. They've gained the capacity to feel deeply without losing themselves in the feeling. And this combination of depth and groundedness is so rare that most people have never encountered it before. But here's what Jung found most significant about the return, the part that makes this stage so psychologically demanding. The empath comes back to the same world they left, the same family dynamics, the same friendship patterns, the same social systems. Nothing out there has changed. The only thing that's changed is the empath's internal structure. And when you bring a fundamentally transformed consciousness back into unchanged circumstances, the friction is extraordinary. The returned empath sits at the family dinner and perceives every dynamic with devastating clarity. They see the scapegoating patterns, the triangulation, the unspoken alliances, the performances everyone maintains. Before their descent, they would have absorbed all of this unconsciously and left the gathering feeling drained without understanding why. Now they see it all explicitly and consciously. Every manipulation is visible. Every unspoken contract is legible. Every dysfunction is obvious. And they have to sit with this perception while everyone else continues the performance as if nothing is happening. And if you're in this right now, if you're sitting in that transparency, seeing every dynamic with a clarity you didn't ask for and can't switch off, I built the True Self-Discovery Guide for exactly this stage. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work to help you navigate the return without reverting to who you were before the descent. It's linked in the description. Now, let me show you what Jung found happens next, because this is where the grief starts to shift. This is the burden of the return that Jung documented extensively. The empath has been transformed by their descent into a person capable of extraordinary perception and groundedness. But that transformation makes ordinary social reality almost unbearable. Not because it's painful the way it used to be, but because it's transparent. They can see through every performance, every defense, every unconscious pattern operating in the room. And they can't pretend they don't see it. The capacity for self-deception that allowed them to participate in dysfunction before the descent has been permanently dismantled. Jung found that returned empaths went through a specific grieving process during this stage. They grieved the simplicity they had lost. There was a kind of innocence in being the unconscious empath, the one who absorbed everything and understood nothing. It was agonizing, yes, but it was also uncomplicated. You felt terrible, and you didn't know why, so you just kept trying harder, loving harder, giving more. The returned empath can never go back to that simplicity. They know too much now. They see too clearly. And there are moments when that clarity feels like a punishment rather than a gift. They grieve relationships that can't survive the return. Jung observed this consistently. Some relationships were built entirely on the empath's unconscious patterns. The friendship that existed because the empath was always the listener, the helper, the one who never had needs. The partnership that functioned because the empath absorbed all the emotional labor without questioning why. The family role that required the empath to remain the peacekeeper, the fixer, the one who held everything together. When the empath returns without those patterns, these relationships lose their foundation. Not because the empath is being cruel or withholding, because the relationship was never built on mutuality. It was built on the empath's self-abandonment. And the returned empath can no longer abandon themselves. The capacity for it has been burned away. This grief is real, and Jung didn't minimize it. You can understand intellectually that a relationship was dysfunctional and still mourn its loss. You can know that someone only valued your caretaking and still feel the absence when they walk away. The return doesn't protect you from grief. It just ensures the grief is clean. You're mourning what actually existed rather than what you wished existed. And that clarity, while eventually liberating, feels merciless in the beginning. But Jung documented something else happening during the return that balanced the grief. Something emerging in the returned empath that hadn't existed before. A quality he described as psychological magnetism. The returned empath begins attracting a completely different caliber of relationship. Not the wounded people who needed their caretaking. Not the unconscious ones who used their sensitivity as supply. But other conscious people who recognize the empath's transformation because they've undergone something similar themselves. Jung called these encounters meetings of the individuated. When someone who has done their deep psychological work meets another person who has done the same, there's an immediate recognition. Not romantic necessarily, though it can be. More fundamental than that, a recognition of shared depth. The conversation shifts instantly from performance to substance. There's no need for masks because both people have already dismantled theirs. There's no need for pretense because both have been through the kind of honesty that makes pretense impossible. These relationships feel alien to the returned empath at first because they're so different from everything they've known. The empath is accustomed to relationships that require management, constant emotional labor, reading between lines, absorbing tension, smoothing conflict. Meeting someone who simply shows up as themselves, who says what they mean, who doesn't need the empath to translate their emotions for them, it's disorienting, almost suspicious. The empath's old programming whispers that something must be wrong, that it shouldn't be this simple. That ease means they're missing something dangerous. Jung recognized this suspicion as the last remnant of the old pattern trying to reassert itself. The returned empath has to learn that healthy relationships feel unfamiliar precisely because they've never had one. The discomfort isn't a warning signal. It's the sensation of experiencing something genuinely new after a lifetime of recycling the same painful dynamic. There's another dimension of the return that Jung found particularly powerful. The returned empath discovers that their sensitivity, which they'd spent their entire previous life experiencing as a wound, has become something else entirely. It's become an instrument of extraordinary precision. Before the descent, their empathic perception was like a microphone with no volume control, picking up everything at maximum intensity, constantly overwhelmed. After the descent, that same microphone has been calibrated. It still picks up everything, but the empath now has the internal architecture to process what they're receiving without being shattered by it. This means the returned empath can do something they could never do before. They can be fully present in emotionally charged environments without losing themselves. They can sit with someone's grief without drowning in it. They can perceive someone's rage without absorbing it as their own. They can hold space for another person's darkness without feeling responsible for illuminating it. This capacity, presence without absorption, is what Jung considered the hallmark of the completed empathic transformation, and it's so rare that most people have never experienced it from another human being. When someone encounters a returned empath holding this kind of presence, the effect is profound. People feel simultaneously seen and safe. Seen because the empath's perception hasn't diminished. They're reading every layer, every nuance, every hidden current. Safe because the empath isn't trying to fix, rescue, or absorb what they're perceiving. They're just witnessing. And that quality of witnessing, being seen without being managed, is something most people have never experienced and desperately need. Jung found that returned empaths often struggled with how to exist in the world with this capacity. Their old way of being, boundaryless, self-sacrificing, constantly available, was unsustainable, but at least it came with social rewards. People praised them for their selflessness, valued them for their availability, needed them for their willingness to absorb. The returned empath receives none of those rewards because they're no longer performing those functions. Instead, they're often perceived as cold, distant, changed for the worse. The people who benefited from the old empath's patterns experience the returned version as a loss. Where did the person I could lean on go? Why won't you carry my emotions anymore? What happened to you? Jung emphasized that this rejection is the final test of the return. The empath has to withstand the social pressure to revert, has to endure being mischaracterized by people who preferred the wounded version, has to grieve being valued more when they were self-destructive than when they're whole. This pressure is enormous because empaths, even returned ones, still care about connection. They haven't become indifferent, they've become selective. And selectivity in a culture that rewards indiscriminate availability looks like coldness. But Jung observed that the empaths who survived this final test entered a psychological state he found remarkable. They achieved what he called integrated sensitivity, the ability to remain fully feeling, fully perceptive, fully alive to emotional reality, while simultaneously being rooted in their own center. They stopped oscillating between complete absorption and total withdrawal. They found the middle ground that had eluded them their entire lives. Present but boundaried, open but grounded, compassionate but sovereign. This integrated state changed how the returned empath experienced daily existence. Ordinary moments became richer because they were being experienced by someone fully present rather than someone perpetually managing other people's emotional states. A conversation with a friend felt different when the empath wasn't spending 80% of their energy monitoring the friend's subtext and managing the friend's comfort. A walk through a crowded space felt different when the empath could perceive the collective emotional atmosphere without being destabilized by it. Even solitude felt different, no longer a desperate recovery from overstimulation, but a genuine choice made by someone who enjoyed their own company. Jung described this as the empath finally inhabiting their own life. Before the descent, the empath lived in everyone else's emotional reality. During the descent, they lived in the dismantling of their old patterns. In the return, for the first time, they live in their own experience, their own emotions, their own perceptions, utilized for their own navigation, rather than everyone else's comfort. This is the final stage, not transcendence, not enlightenment, not some elevated spiritual state. Just the radical simplicity of being a person who is fully present in their own existence. And yet Jung recognized a paradox at the heart of the return. The empath who finally inhabits their own life often becomes more genuinely helpful to others than they ever were during their caretaking years. Not because they're trying to help, because their presence itself has become healing. When you sit with someone who is fully grounded in themselves, who perceives you clearly without needing to fix you, who can hold the full weight of your emotional reality without flinching or absorbing, that experience does something to your nervous system that no amount of advice or caretaking ever could. It shows you, through direct experience, that it's possible to be both deeply feeling and completely stable. That sensitivity and strength aren't opposites, that you can be seen without being consumed. This is the gift the returned empath brings back from their descent. Not techniques or teachings or wisdom, they can articulate in words, a way of being that demonstrates what wholeness looks like in practice. Jung believed this was the true purpose of the empathic journey, not to become a healer of others, but to become a living example of what integrated consciousness looks like. Not to rescue anyone, but to show, simply by existing as themselves, that the journey through darkness and back is survivable. That what waits on the other side of the descent is not emptiness, but a kind of fullness most people don't know is possible. If you recognize yourself in this, if you've been through the withdrawal, the silence, the dismantling, and you're standing now at the edge of return, unsure how to bring this new version of yourself back into a world that seems unchanged, Jung would tell you that the uncertainty you feel is appropriate. The return is genuinely hard. You will be misunderstood. You will lose relationships that can't hold the weight of your transformation. You will grieve a simplicity you can never reclaim, and you will sometimes wonder whether the descent was worth it, whether seeing this clearly is a gift or a sentence. But Jung would also tell you that the return is where everything you survived becomes purposeful, not in a spiritual bypassing way, not in a everything happens for a reason way, in a structural psychological way. Every pattern you dismantled gives you stability you never had. Every shadow you integrated gives you wholeness you never knew. Every illusion you released gives you clarity that cannot be taken from you. The descent gave you the raw material. The return is where you build with it. You're not coming back as who you were. You're not supposed to. The person who left couldn't sustain themselves in this world. That's why the descent happened in the first place. The person returning can sustain themselves because they've been rebuilt from the foundation up. Different architecture, different operating system, same sensitivity, completely different relationship to it. And that difference is everything. The final stage of awakening isn't a mystical experience or a peak state. It's the quiet, demanding, beautiful work of bringing a transformed self back into ordinary life and learning to live there, fully present, fully feeling, fully yours. That's the empath's return. Not a destination, but a way of moving through the world that honors everything the descent cost while refusing to be defined by it. Jung spent his career watching people attempt this journey, Most stopped before the return, but the ones who made it back carried something in them that he could only describe as the mark of genuine wholeness, a quality so rare it changed the atmosphere of every room they entered. That's what's waiting on the other side, not perfection, not painlessness, not the absence of difficulty, just the profound, grounded, hard-won capacity to be fully alive in your own existence, to feel everything without drowning, to see everything without looking away, to return to the world, not as the person who left, but as the person who was always underneath, waiting for the courage to emerge. And if you're standing at the edge of that return right now, unsure how to carry everything the descent gave you back into ordinary life, the True Self-Discovery Guide was made for this moment. 24 exercises to help you build with the raw material instead of being buried by it. It's in the description whenever you're ready.